as excitable as his older brother Edward. Albert was a more withdrawn figure, closer to his father than his other brothers, and in keeping with his father's interests, he enjoyed the quiet life away in the countryside, out of the public eye.
Illnesses and a lack of confidence plagued Bertie's childhood. The young prince suffered the indignity of wearing leg braces, and at the age of 8, he began to develop a stammer, an ailment which would haunt him for most of his life.
George VI was the opposite of his brother Edward growing up. He was Albert, he was known as Bertie. He was shy, he was retiring, while his brother was outgoing. He wasn't as good looking as Edward, he wasn't as well dressed, he wasn't as charismatic, he didn't have the same success with women.
Edward's relationship with his younger brother Bertie was very warm when they were younger boys. There was very little between them in terms of their age, and they grew up best of friends. However, as the two men grew older, life became a bit more difficult. George had a very specific way that he wanted to live. He was much more of a kind of private figure. He was more withdrawn in terms of his public image. He didn't have the sort of the charisma and the glamour that was possessed by his older brother Edward. He didn't have a great deal of confidence. And the reason why he didn't have a great deal of confidence was because he had a stammer. Now, psychologists have sought to try and explain the stammer in relation to the fraught relationship that the royal children had with the king, with their father, George V, growing up. The young Bertie growing up had been almost terrified by his father and the expectations that his father had imposed on him.
George V was very much an old-fashioned patriarch. He was somebody who believed not just in the idea of spare the rod and spoil the child, but also in the very Victorian idea that children should be seen and not heard. So of his 4 sons, the 2 eldest, later Edward VIII and George VI, had a very difficult relationship with him because he was this cold figure and his wife Mary was cold as well. And it's very much a sense that everyone was brought up in a way to understand duty, and the idea of duty as the central tenet of what you were suspected to do as a royal prince was something that he laboured home intensively.
As a young man, Albert attended the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, and at the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, he was dispatched with the Collingwood and was present at the Great Naval Battle of Jutland in the summer of 1916.
He served in World War I. He was somebody who was the first member of his own family to have done so, to have served on active service. He had a great respect for the armed forces, and you can see that if he never had become king, he would have been one of those figures within the royal family who was always well liked, whose debilitating stammer meant that public speaking was a nightmare for him, but in private life he was absolutely fine. He wasn't somebody who was affected by it to the extent that he was publicly.
He didn't have a great deal of confidence. He wasn't as outgoing as other members of his family, and a bit more withdrawn. I think in that respect we can understand why later on he would be a more reluctant figure when it came to becoming king.
As a character, he was a much less likely king than Edward ever was, because he was somebody who didn't seem to be very comfortable around people.
Without freedom, there can be no enduring peace, and without peace, no enduring freedom.
By 1920, the 25-year-old Prince Albert would start looking for a wife and would find her in his longtime friend, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. The couple were married on the 26th of April 1923 in Westminster Abbey and became the Duke and Duchess of York.
Bertie found his closest confidant and greatest supporter in his wife, Elizabeth. After a number of unsuccessful attempts to woo her and propose marriage to her, she eventually consented and agreed to marry him. There was some talk at the time about whether she was in fact more interested in his older brother, Edward, Prince of Wales, and that was one of the reasons why she originally turned Bertie down. Nevertheless, she would get married to Bertie. They would embody everything that was best about the monarchy in this period, in that they presented themselves as very dutiful figures. They went out into public life, they toured towns and cities, they opened hospitals, they did all that was expected of royals of their generation.
His relationship with his wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyons, who later became Queen Elizabeth, was, one doesn't want to sentimentalise these things, but it was a very happy relationship. The two of them had known each other for many years.